I've told a few people some of my drug history, but have never admitted to anyone the full abuse that my whole life I've had a problem with addiction. It didn't kick in until I was 16 and had my first cigarette shortly after I was drinking coffee. Every day. I still do these two things, but do they really count? I tell myself that while nicotine and caffeine are probably the most addictive drugs used in the world. Anyway, around 17, I started smoking weed. A year later, at 18, I was taking pills from my friend's parents. I was stealing Adderall and Vyvanse. About a month later, I was consuming 70 milligrams of Vyvanse and 30 milligrams of Adderall a day. I went from weighing 135 pounds to 94 pounds at my worst. Eventually, I started hearing voices in my head and had drug-induced schizophrenia. How did I kick this? The few people I told I said it was from pure mental strength, when in reality my source ran out and I couldn't find any more. That was my first big drug addiction. Soon after high school, I was on my way to college. At this time, I was just into smoking weed. College, I started doing a plethora of drugs. Painkillers, uppers, downers, you name it, I was doing it. My friends and I eventually rented our own place to do drugs in peace. We really got into psychedelics at one point. That fucked me up for a while. I never stuck with one drug for too long, and I would just take whatever I could find. But at 1.1, went on a 2-month binge of meth. You can bet I dropped out of college at that point. That withdrawal sucked. That was one of the first big withdrawals I went through that had me immobile mentally and physically. Somehow, I was able to see it was killing me, even though after I kicked meth, my dumbass tried heroin. Luckily, I didn't form a huge addiction and only tried it for like a week. Soon I found a reliable hookup for Xanax. Xanax was my favorite, and it fucked my life up the most at that point. Nothing really ever made me black out fully. Yeah, some parts of the night were fuzzy, but I could remember most of it. But the worst came out of me when I would specifically drink alcohol and take Xanax. One night my girlfriend hung herself, blackout on Xanax, and that floored me. I'm crying as I write this RN. It was a wake-up call, and I told myself I'd go sober. I thought the meth withdrawal was going to be the worst I've ever felt. I was very wrong. I was in pure agony for days. Going through withdrawal is like someone is ripping your brain in two, like someone ripping a phone book in half. Shaking violently, screaming at everyone, scratching holes into my body. It was bad. But I kicked it and then decided I would never do drugs again. Well, that was a lie to myself. I did manage to stay off Xanax and never really get addicted to any drugs like that again. But I still took a pill of whatever, or smoked some weed every now and then. But I stayed away from the hard drugs and all PSYCHEDOIKS dot. So the years go on and the drugs do too. I'm around 27 to 28, and I finally kicked drugs out of my life, besides nicotine and caffeine, and I feel great. That's until my best friend of 20 years, my number one homie, introduces me to kratom. He was the closest thing I had to a brother. Now, I've definitely heard of kratom in my years. All my other drug friends would say to kratom users, why don't you do real drugs? And that shit is fake. It don't do nothing for you or stuff like that. But I slipped up and thought it can be so bad if it's legally sold in a store. I'll try this out. My bestie said it gave you a boost of energy, or if you took a lot, it felt like heroin or something. I bought a baggie of pilled kratom and popped a few. First it was a couple every day. Then it was a couple in the morning. And then a couple around late afternoon dot. Then it was a couple around the morning, afternoon, and then in the evening before. I was taking 20 pills in the morning at 6 a.m. and then 8 more pill every 4 hours until around 5 p.m. It got bad. I would feel symptoms of withdrawal within 8 hours of not consuming any. KRAOM dot. My best friend and I were living in the same state. That wasn't our home state. Eventually, I moved back to my home state, and he stayed with his GF. One day I woke up for work, and his GF called me saying he overdosed and died. He relapsed and was buying drugs off the dark web. He was always into that, ever since college, but he kicked it for a while. I knew he started doing it again, but didn't realize how bad. He had 11 different drugs in his body. I was still taking kratom religiously. It's been 11 months since his death, and I just went through kratom withdrawal and kicked it for good. People don't do kratom, especially if you have a history like mine. That withdrawal was just as bad as Xanax, maybe worse since it's so fresh in my mind. I laid in bed for 2 full days, crying in a pool of my own sweat as I shook violently. It was fucking terrible. The mood swings were insane. Many times I'm out unaliving myself through the withdrawal. Even if it's legal to buy and considered a herbal supplement, I urge you to not start using. It is not worth it. Besides vaping and coffee, I'm completely sober, and I plan to keep it that way. I'm 31, almost 32 now. I'd be lying if I said I didn't have any regrets. Hopefully, one day I can overcome that. Thanks for reading if you made it this far. Don't be an idiot like me and stay clean. Even though drugs can make you feel on top of the world, in the end, it'll only bring you misery and despair.